Stand-up comedy is in a bad way. It's really gone downhill in recent years. I don't know if it's the pandemic that just destroyed everyone's brain, or if this started before then, but seriously, ask yourself, when was the last time you watched a comedy special that was truly great? For me, it was probably Chappelle's Sticks and Stones back in 2019, maybe. So that's just before the pandemic. And besides Burr, Louis, and Patrice earlier in the decade, there wasn't a whole lot of great comedians either in the last decade, but I guess since these guys were so great, it just overshadowed that. It's been 4 years since the start of the pandemic, and in that time we've gotten almost half a decade's worth of mediocre comedy. You could argue it goes even further back than that, and if something doesn't improve soon, it'll be the whole decade. So, what I'm asking is, when has comedy been in a worse state? And after last year's showing in the comedy department, it doesn't really have any improvements coming anytime soon. You only have to look at Joe Coy's hosting of the Grammys just the other week, because that's the state of comedy nowadays. But that's where the paradox comes in, because while this is probably the worst period in stand-up history, it's also more lucrative now than it's ever been before. Comedians in the past would have to be in multiple shows to make the money that they're making now from stand-up and podcasting. So clearly fans aren't benefiting from this, instead they're being thrown more and more shit. And I think a big moment in comedy recently pretty much sums up how people are feeling about the stand-up world. Everyone likes when Hollywood and celebrities get exposed, but the way that people got immersed in the Katt Williams interview recently, which was great, by the way, I think it reflects, though, in some way, just how much comedy has fallen. People really want these comedians to be exposed. They're hoping that he gets specific and shits on these people. Everyone has always liked this kind of thing, but I don't know, to me it just seems like people are way too into this for there not to be another reason behind it. The best moment in comedy at the moment is a comedian not just shitting on other comedians, but he's saying the kinds of things that everyone is thinking about, whether it's accusing these comedians of theft, or being industry plants and only caring about being famous, or that they want to be the edgy guy. This is still a thing, by the way. Comedians want to be seen as someone who pushes boundaries, and so everyone sees this as fake. So when someone shits on them, everyone rejoices. So everyone loves it, especially when he brings up a particular side of the comedy world, which is the LA sucks, let's move to Austin, Rogan sphere. One member, of course, is the infamous Brendan Schaub. We're not entirely sure if he's one of Rogan's six, the six comedians that Katt Williams says Rogan is pushing that aren't funny. Schaub is still the internet punching bag, even this long after Gringo Papi, the much-awaited follow-up to the lowest-rated comedy special ever. So there's pretty much an entire genre of YouTube videos that exist now just to shit on him on a daily basis, and it doesn't help that Rogan pretty much dismisses him any chance that he gets. Everyone seems to think that this guy sucks, it would seem. But he still managed to fail upwards, and if you watch how he describes comedy...
Just so you morons know the way comedy works, is when you go into city, if you eat dicks, if you eat all the dicks, when you go back, they do not buy tickets.
Yeah.
It's not, even if they're like, oh, I like Steve, I like him on Jacket, it doesn't matter. They're not buying your ticket.
Right.
So for you to come back to a market, if you're selling more and more tickets, it means you're doing something right, it means you're funny.
Yeah.
So for me, I always gauge my level of stand-up and how I'm doing depend when I go back to markets if I'm selling more and more tickets.
He seems to judge it by how much money he's making and not by actually how funny he is, which seems like a common thing, especially coming from our next comedian. The I'm not an alcoholic shirtless guy, Bert Kreischer. What's odd about Bert is that you'd think, since he understands his audience so well, that he would be somewhat self-aware, but instead, it's the trait that he lacks the most. Whether it's his delusional way of talking about his athletic ability, or his alcohol consumption, this guy doesn't seem to see the issue here. And we know how much him and his circle focuses on the business side of things. I mean, look at how he gives advice to up-and-coming comedians.
It's such a huge business that if you're a guy who just wants to make people laugh, you have to, one, negotiate the open mic scene, which is insane. Just getting out of an open mic scene and getting to the next level is crazy. That's like little baby turtles have a better chance making it to the ocean, making it to deep water than an open micer does getting out of a comedy scene. Then you have to get into the clubs, and we haven't even got you into Hollywood yet. Now you got to go to Hollywood and try to pitch a show and see if you're actually likable. I mean, there are so many hurdles to get through that then you go, oh, you've got to start a podcast. You got to have a social media presence. You got to have a social media team. Do you have a producer? Who's doing your content for you? Oh, by the way, your digital footprint needs to be this, and that's going to cost you $10,000 a month. Where's that $10,000 from? You're not getting it from stand-up. I mean, dude, I run a business, and I run a fairly successful business, and I am one of the biggest comics in the world, and I'm still going like, I'm checking, making sure I'm paying my overhead. Like, it's crazy.
This isn't necessarily a bad thing. Up-and-coming comedians should know the hoops that they're probably going to have to go through if they want to get to the top, if they want to be that. But that's the thing. There's no advice here about how to craft a better joke or how to be funnier, because that's not important. And if you listen to comedians, anyone who's famous nowadays and is also a comedian is just automatically funny and they don't need any improvement. Well, that's the way it would seem. No one seems to ever give these people advice. This is the guy who released the Machine movie, which was a flop, even after he tried promoting it everywhere, and even after Mark Hamill was in the movie, it still managed to fail. It'll eventually make some money back, I'm sure, but it just shows that these podcaster comedians don't have the pull that they think they do. They have enough to make the movie, but they don't have enough to encourage anyone to actually go and watch it. And his best friend Tom Segura got exposed towards the end of last year, and maybe even earlier, showing his true colours. Everyone saw who he really was, which is an out-of-touch Karen. Some people still think he's joking about his hatred of the poors and flipping out over flight attendants, but it's not really a joke. I get that he wants to play it off as if it is a joke, but it's not, or at least it isn't anymore. And I can't really speak to the overall quality of that 69-minute special they released at the end of the year because I haven't seen it in its entirety, but from the clips I've seen courtesy of Red Bar, and he showed a lot of clips, this seems like some of the worst thrown together at the last minute shit I've ever seen. Like, who in the fuck wants to watch Danny Brown playing tennis? And Tom Segura's bit in this special is him and his wife taking etiquette classes. I'm not even joking. This is what makes for comedy these days. And what makes it worse is that you don't get to own it. You actually had to pay $10 to rent it for 2 weeks, which in a world where we have Patreon and streaming services, this seems like a scam. So there's only a few guys left that you can actually trust to make something good, and after seeing Chappelle's latest special, it wasn't anything special. I'll be honest, I laughed a couple of times, but the problem is a lot of that material was old. Like, some of it was old even when he first wrote it, which is an issue when your comedy covers politics and the state of the world. When that's the case, you can't really be talking about things that were old in the zeitgeist about a year ago. There's people on both sides going crazy about this whole special because of the trans joke. Some people are saying you can't make those kinds of jokes, and other people are acting like Chappelle is somehow like Jesus or some shit. You know, he's being cancelled for the sins of the anti-woke. Trans jokes have gotten old, though to be fair to him, I think he sort of had to acknowledge what happened in his last special. If he didn't address it at all, it would have been kind of weird, and he could have handled it worse, to be honest. But none of that is really relevant because the real problem is that this was pretty mediocre at the end of the day. And then, of course, we have the gorilla in the room here, which is Joe Rogan, the most famous stand-up comedian at the moment, owner of the comedy mothership where you can't bring your phone into the theatre or heckle, otherwise you'll get banned. You wouldn't want to hurt the fragile ego of the comedian. Ooh, we wouldn't want to offend these comedians. And he hasn't released a special since like 2018, and he wasn't never really famous in the first place for his stand-up. He was on like some sitcom first, and then he had the UFC commentary and Fear Factor, and then of course his podcast, as well as being the guy to call out Carlos Mencia for stealing jokes, which was going to forever cement him in the stand-up comedy history. But again, this had nothing to do with him actually being funny, so again, no one can really quote a Joe Rogan joke off the top of their heads. There's a bunch of reasons for people to turn on Rogan as well. All the cringy shit he's been saying recently. also promoting Brendan Schaub and all of the Rogan sphere. Maybe that has led to people turning on the entire genre and noticing the changes in the performers, or maybe this is just what happens organically when fans are given trash after trash. And for whatever reason, comedians seem to be getting more and more out of touch than they ever were before, and somehow less funny as they age. Which is very odd because there's a belief amongst stand-ups that you get better with age. People like Carlin come to mind, as his material that he made in his later years is often what people remember the most. So what makes this crazier is that some of these guys are actually getting close to George Carlin's age. Okay, maybe not 71, but they're close to the age at which he was arguably performing at his best, as these are the specials that are often come to mind when people quote his material. So other than the special he did in the 70s, where he did the famous 7 words you can't say on TV, the specials I see people quote from the most were, to me, probably his best ones, which were the later ones. The 1999 special, You Were All Diseased, when he was 62, the 2001 special, Complaints and Grievances, when he was 64, and arguably his best special in 1992, Jamming in New York, when he was 55. So if Carlin was at his best at 55, how does he compare to more modern comedians that are getting older? Well, Joe Rogan is 56, Bert Kreischer is 51, and his friend Tom Segura has already peaked at like 35 or 40, and he's already falling off in his 40s. There's Jim Brewer, the famous parrot comedian. He's 56 as well. Joe Coy is 52. Bobby Lee, from what I've heard, has been doing the same material for the last 20 years, and he's 51. And Brian Callen, Brendan Schaub's best friend, is 56. Now, I'm not saying that any of these guys should actually be on Carlin's level, but none of these guys are funny in the first place. In fact, some of these guys have arguably gotten worse at stand-up, and are actually worse now than they ever were before. Actually, come to think of it, most of the good comedians that are still around have already peaked at an early age or in their 40s, and because of that, these comedians are never going to be remembered in the same way that, say, Carlin and Rodney Dangerfield or Don Rickles were. Joe Coy's Grammy performance can't be called anything more than pathetic. To be fair to him, though, these things are almost always cringe. The comedians are also less inclined to actually want to host because it's not very rewarding for them. But considering how Chris Rock was treated on stage, why would anyone want to do this shit again? But there was actually a time where comedians were actually good at these things, but that was a long time ago. People liked when Ricky Gervais hosted because he wasn't sucking off the actors, and it was about as close as any comedian has ever gotten to really being able to say what they want to these celebrities to their fucking faces. I think it should have been even harsher, to be honest. Like, at the end, all the celebrities should have been, like, so mad that they wanted to Will Smith him themselves. And this, of course, was probably the last time that Ricky Gervais was actually good on stage. I mean, just check out his last 2 specials. So, of course, I'm not actually hating on stand-up. There actually is a lot of stand-up that I like, and there are always going to be people that are funny, but it's just hard to not call this a dying art form. The best way that I can respect this art form is to do what I believe stand-up is all about, and that's calling it how I see it.